안녕하세요. 11월 2일 수요일 연준 발표가 나왔습니다. 연준회의 발표가 나와서 오늘 라이브를 좀 일찍 켰고요. 간단히 발표된 내용을 그대로 구글 트랜슬레이트를 사용한 한국어로 여러분한테 읽어 드릴게요. 벌써 뭐 보신 분도 있을 수도 있고요. 뭐 아닐 수도 있지만 일단 제롬 파웰보다 5분 빠르게 읽어 드리도록 하겠습니다. 최근 지표는 지출과 생산의 완만한 성장을 보여줍니다. 최근 몇 달 동안 일자리 증가는 견조했고 실업률은 낮은 수준을 유지했습니다. 인플레이션은 팬데믹, 더 높은 식품 및 에너지 가격, 광범위한 가격 압력과 관련된 수급 불균형을 반영하여 높은 수준을 유지하고 있습니다. 우크라이나에 대한 러시아의 전쟁은 엄청난 인명과 경제적 어려움을 이야기하고 있습니다. 전쟁과 관련 사건들은 인플레이션에 추가적인 상승 압력을 가하고 있으며 세계 경제 활동에 부담을 주고 있습니다. 위원회는 인플레이션 위험에 매우 주의를 기울입니다. 위원회는 장기적으로 2%의 비율로 최대 고용과 인플레이션을 달성하려고 합니다. 이러한 목표를 지원하기 위해 위원회는 연방기금 금리 목표 범위를 3에서 3.75 그러니까 3.75에서 4%로 높이기로 결정했습니다. 위원회는 인플레이션을 시간이 지남에 따라 2%로 되돌릴 수 있을 만큼 충분히 제한적인 통화 정책 기조를 달성하기 위하여 목표 범위를 지속적으로 인상하는 것이 적절할 것으로 예상합니다. 목표 범위의 향후 증가 속도를 결정할 때 위원회는 통화 정책의 누적 긴축, 통화 정책이 경제 활동 및 인플레이션에 영향을 미치는 시차, 경제 및 금융 발전을 고려할 것입니다. 그래서 이제 시차라는 게 이제 좀 중요한 것 같아요. 그리고 또한 위원회는 재무부 증권 및 기관 부채 및 기관 모기지 담보부 증권의 보유를 계속 축소할 것이며 5월에 발행된 연준의 대차 대조표 규모 축소 계획에 설명된 대로 위원회는 인플레이션을 2% 목표로 되돌릴 것을 강력히 약속합니다. 통화정책의 적절한 입장을 평가함에 있어 위원회는 들어오는 정보가 그러니까 데이터 디펜더 이런 얘기죠. 경제 전망에 미치는 영향을 계속 모니터링 할 것입니다. 위원회는 위원회의 목표 달성을 방해할 수 있는 위험이 발생될 경우 적절하게 통화 정책 및 입장을 조정할 준비가 되어 있습니다. 위원회의 평가는 공중보건, 노동시장의 상황, 인플레이션 압력 및 인플레이션 기대치, 재정 및 국제 발전에 대한 판독값을 포함한 광범위한 정보를 고려할 것입니다. 이렇게 좀 이따가 제롬 파웰이 영어로 얘기를 할 겁니다. 그래서 주요 내용 이렇게 좀 이러레이스 안 한 거 이렇게 딱 포인트로 된 거를 보면은요. 이자율을 3.9%로 인상하기로 만장일치로 가결했다. 그런 얘기를 하고 있어요. 그리고 정책의 일환으로 공개시장위원회는 다른 지시가 있을 때까지 뉴욕 연방준비은행의 공개시장 데스크가 다음 국내 정책에 따라 공개시장 계정에서 거래를 실행하도록 승인하고 지시하기로 하였습니다. 그래서 지금 하는 거는 금리를 3에서 3.75에서 4%로 올리는 걸 했고요. 그리고 최소 입찰률 4% 및 총 운영항도 5천억 야간 환매 계약 운영 수행한다 그러고요. 그리고 뭐 다른 내용들을 보면은 뭐 이건 다 채권에 관한 거고요. 그리고 MBS 350억 달러 한도를 초과하는 연방준비제도 이사의 기관 부채 및 기관 MBS 보유액에서 모기지 담보부 증권 MBS를 재투자한다. 뭐 이렇게 얘기하고 있어요. 그리고 지금 여기에는 표현되지 않은 것 같은데요. 뉴스에 나왔던 내용에는 이제 우리가 예상했던 대로 일단은 속도를 좀 조절을 하겠다 그런 얘기를 했어요. 일단 저런 파일의 연설을 한번 보시도록 하시죠.
Families and businesses. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve and serves as the bedrock of our economy. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised our policy interest rate by 75 basis points, and we continue to anticipate that ongoing increases will be appropriate. We are moving our policy stance purposefully to a level that will be sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2%. In addition, we're continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet. Restoring price stability will likely require maintaining a restrictive stance of policy for some time. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy has slowed significantly from last year's rapid pace. Real GDP rose at a pace of 2.6% last quarter, but is unchanged so far this year. Recent indicators point to modest growth of spending and production this quarter. Growth in consumer spending has slowed from last year's rapid pace, in part reflecting lower real disposable income and tighter financial conditions. Activity in the housing sector has weakened significantly, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. Despite the slowdown in growth, the labor market remains extremely tight, with the unemployment rate at a 50-year low, job vacancies still very high, and wage growth elevated. Job gains have been robust, with employment rising by an average of 289,000 jobs per month over August and September. Although job vacancies have moved below their highs, and the pace of job gains has slowed from earlier in the year, the labor market continues to be out of balance, with demand substantially exceeding the supply of available workers. The labor force participation rate is little changed since the beginning of the year. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in September, total PCE prices rose 6.2%, excluding the volatile food and energy categories. Core PCE prices rose 5.1%. And the recent inflation data again have come in higher than expected. Price pressures remain evident across a broad range of goods and services. Russia's war against Ukraine has boosted prices for energy and food and has created additional upward pressure on inflation. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. But that is not grounds for complacency. The longer the current bout of high inflation continues, the greater the chance that expectations of higher inflation will become entrenched. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we're strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by 75 basis points. And we are continuing the process of significantly reducing the size of our balance sheet, which plays an important role in firming the stance of monetary policy. With today's action, we've raised interest rates by 3.75 percentage points this year. We anticipate that ongoing increases in the target range for the federal funds rate will be appropriate in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. Financial conditions have tightened significantly in response to our policy actions, and we are seeing the effects on demand in the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, such as housing. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. That's why we say in our statement that in determining the pace of future increases in the target range, We will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy and the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation. At some point, as I've said in the last two press conferences, it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases.
여기가 지금 중요한 포인트예요.
That will be sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% goal. There is significant uncertainty around that level of interest rates. Even so, we still have some ways to go. And incoming data since our last meeting suggests that the ultimate level of interest rates will be higher than previously expected. Our decisions will depend on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. We will continue to make our decisions meeting by meeting and communicate our thinking as clearly as possible. We're taking forceful steps to moderate demand so that it comes into better alignment with supply. Our overarching focus is using our tools to bring inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a sustained period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices in the longer run. The historical record cautions strongly against prematurely loosening policy. We will stay the course until the job is done. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
오케이, 아까 제가 처음에 읽어드린 거랑 같은 맥락의 내용이에요. 근데 약간 좀 살이 더 붙은 내용이 있고요. 근데 이게 지금 팍 떨어진 이유가 아까 시간을 두고 속도를 조절해 보겠다 뭐 그런 얘기를 하는 순간 이렇게 팍 떨어져 버리네요. 그게 피벗이 아니라 가지고 실망을 하는 건지 슬로우 퍼징이라 가지고 실망을 하는 건지 모르겠지만 그런 지금 리액션이 나와 있는 상태고요. 이제 보면은 이 질문이 더 중요한 것 같아요. 질문 좀 들어볼게요.
Of course, that's what we'd all love to see, but I've never thought of that as the appropriate test for slowing the pace of increases or for identifying the appropriately restrictive level that we're aiming for. We need to bring our policy stance down to a level that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to our 2% objective over the medium term. How will we know that we've reached that level? Well, we'll take into account the full range of analysis and data that bear on that question, guided by our assessment of how much financial conditions have tightened, the effects that tightening is actually having on the real economy and on inflation, taking into consideration lags, as I mentioned. We will be looking at real rates, for example, all across the yield curve and all other financial conditions and as we make that assessment.
이건 질문을 제가 못 들어가지고 무슨 대답인지 잘 모르겠어요. 잠깐만.
With Reuters, look, I'm sure there's going to be tons of confusion out there about whether this means you're going to slow in December or not. Would you say that the bias right now is not for another 75 basis point increase?
지금 다음에 75 올릴 거냐 안 올릴 거냐 그
What I want to
질문했어요.
do is put that question of pace in the context of our broader tightening program, if I may, and to talk about the statement language along the way. So I think you can think about our tightening program as really addressing three questions. The first of which was and has been how fast to go. The second is how high to raise our policy rate. And the third will be eventually how long to remain at a restrictive level. So
그냥 자기가 그냥
on the first
질문
question,
잘하네.
how fast to tighten policy.
얼마나
it's
빨리
very
지금
important
이자를
to move
올렸느냐.
expeditiously, and we have clearly done so. We've moved 3.75% since March. Admittedly,
연준이 생각하기에도 지금 상당히 빨리 올렸다.
And that's certainly appropriate, given the persistence and strength of inflation and the low level from which we started. So now we come to the second question, which is how high to raise our policy rate, and we're saying
이제 터미널 레이스에 대해서 얘기해요.
sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation to our 2% target over time, and we put that into our post-meeting statement. Because that really does become the important question we think now is how far to go, and I'll talk more about that. We think there's some ground to cover, but before we meet that test, and that's why we say that ongoing rate increases will be appropriate. And as I mentioned,
뭐 이자는 계속 올릴 거다 뭐 그런 얘기를 하네요.
the strong labor market report, but particularly the CPI report, do suggest to me that we may
왜냐면 지금 상황에서 안 올리겠다 그렇게 얘기는 못 하는 거니까.
at the time of the September meeting. That level is very uncertain though, and I would say, we're going to find it over time. Of course, with the lags between policy and economic activity, there's a lot of uncertainty. So we note that in determining the pace of future increases, we'll take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy as well as the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation. So I would say as we come closer to that level, move more into restrictive territory, the question of speed becomes less important than the second and third questions. And that's why I've said at the last two press conferences that at some point it will become appropriate to slow the pace of increases. So that time is coming, and it may come.
그리고 슬로우다운하는 그 시간이 올 것이다. 그런 얘기를 해요.
No decision has been made.
아직 디시전은 메일한 거 없고.
About this at the next meeting, a discussion. To be clear, let me say again, the question of when to moderate the pace of increases is now much less important than the question of how high to raise rates and how long to keep monetary policy.
지금 이자율을 올리는 속도를 줄인다 그거보다는 언제까지 올리고 언제까지 유지를 할 건가가 더 중요한 질문이다. 그런 얘기를 하네요.
Possibility now, given all the concerns really around the globe about Fed policy sort of driving ahead, and everybody else,
원래 좀 애매하게 얘기를 해줘야 돼요. 너무 명확하게 얘기하면은 시장이 이상하게 반응할 수 있으니까.
I'm pleased that we have moved as fast as we have. I don't think we've over tightened. I think there's very difficult to make a case that our current level is too tight, given that inflation still runs well above the federal funds rate. So I think that at this meeting, the last two meetings, as I've mentioned, I've said that there would come a point, and this was a meeting at which we had a discussion about what that might mean, and we did discuss this, and as I mentioned, we'll discuss it again in December. But there's I don't have any sense that we've over tightened or moved too fast. I think it's been good and a successful program.
지금 얘기하는 거는 이제 너무 빠른 것도 아니고 뭐 너무 타이트하게 한 것도 아니다. 그냥 우리 적당히 잘 하고 있는 것이다. 그런 식으로 표현을 해요. 표현상으로는.
And cover it we will.
Nick Tamaros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, core BCE inflation on a 3 or 6 month annualized basis and on a 12-month basis has been running in the high fours, close to 5%. Is there any reason to think you won't have to raise rates at least above that level to be confident that you are imparting enough restraint to bring inflation down?
So this is the question of does the policy rate need to get above the inflation rate? And I would say there are a range of views on that. That's the classic Taylor principle view. But I would think you'd look more at a forward-looking measure of inflation to look at that. But I think the answer is we'll want to get the policy rate to a level where it is where the real interest rate is positive. We will want to do that. I do not think of it as the single and only touchstone, though. I think you put some weight on that. You also put some weight on rates across the curve. Very few people borrow at the short end at the federal funds rate, for example. So households and businesses, if they're very meaningfully positive interest rates all across the curve for them, credit spreads are larger, so borrowing rates are significantly higher, and I think financial conditions have tightened quite a bit. So I would look at that as an important feature. I put some weight on it, but I wouldn't say it's something that is the single dominant thing to look at.
If I could follow up, what is your best assessment or the staff's best assessment right now of the current rate of underlying inflation?
I don't have a specific number for you there. So there are many models that look at that. And I mean, one way to look at it is that it's a pretty stationary object, and that when inflation runs above that level.
이거는 질문이 좀 제가 해석하기가 좀 복잡한데 그냥 원론적인 얘기를 하는 거예요. 이거 기준금리랑 그런 거랑 관계돼가지고 인플레이션 레이시랑 빼가지고 거기까지 맞추는 게 어떻게 되는 거냐 뭐 그런 거에 대한 설명하고 그런 거에 질문에 대한 질의를 하고 있는 거죠. 질문은 뭐 영향가 별로 없네요.
Questions. Gina Smile of New York Times. I wondered Do you see any evidence at this stage that inflation is or is at risk of becoming entrenched?
인플레이션이 좀 컨트롤되고 있냐 그런 얘기를 물어봤어요.
I guess I would start by pointing to expectations. So if we saw longer term expectations moving up, that would be very troubling. And they were moving up a little bit at the middle part of this year, and they've moved now back down. That's one piece of data. Shorter term inflation expectations moved up between the last meeting and this meeting. And we don't think those are as indicative, but they may be important in the wage setting process. There's a school of thought that believes that. So that's very concerning. I guess the other thing I would say is that the longer we have, we're now 18 months into this episode of high inflation, and we don't have a clearly identified scientific way of understanding at what point inflation becomes entrenched. And so the thing we need to do from a risk management standpoint is to use our tools forcefully but thoughtfully and get inflation under control, get it down to 2%, get it behind us. That's what we really need to do and what we're strongly committed to doing.
그냥 뭐 과정에 대해서 얘기해요. 18개월 동안 인플레이션이 계속 이런 문제가 되고 있었는데 정확하게 어느 지점부터 떨어지고 올라가고 그런 거는 모르겠다고 그렇게 대답하네요.
The statement points to lag times. I'm wondering if you can walk us through how you judge those lag effects, what that timeline looks like over the coming months or even a year, and where you would expect it to show up in different parts of the economy.
Yeah, so the way I would think about that is, it's a commonly for a long time thought that monetary policy works with long and variable legs, and that it works first on financial conditions and then on economic activity and then perhaps later than that even on inflation. So that's been the thinking for a long time. There was an old literature that made those lags out to be.
질문이 별로 시장에 이렇게 환호하는 그런 질문들 아니에요. 지금 거의 다. 인플레이션이 언제 잡혀가지고 언제부터 뭐 다른 경제 구조로 보이기 시작할 것이냐 뭐 이런 질문. 좀 대답하기 어려운 질문만 하고 있네요.
And then that would affect economic activity and inflation. Now, financial conditions react well before, in expectation of monetary policy. That's the way it has moved for a quarter of a century, is in the direction of financial conditions, then monetary policy, because the markets are thinking what is the central bank going to do, and there are plenty of economists that also think that once financial conditions change, that the effects on the economy are actually faster than they would have been before. We don't know that. I guess the thing I would say is it's highly uncertain, and so from a risk management standpoint, it would be irresponsible not to ignore them, but you want to consider them, but not take them literally. So I think it's a very difficult place to be, but I would tend to want to be in the middle, looking carefully at what's actually happening with the economy, and trying to make good decisions from a risk management standpoint, remembering, of course, that if we were to over-tighten, we could then use our tools strongly to support the economy, whereas if we don't get inflation under control because we don't tighten enough, now we're in a situation where inflation will become entrenched, and the costs, the employment costs in particular, will be much higher potentially. So from a risk management standpoint, we want to be sure that we don't make the mistake of either failing to tighten enough or loosening policy too soon.
And if I could follow up, should we interpret the addition to the statement to mean that more weight is put into those lag effects than they would have been after previous rate hikes?
So I think as we move now into restrictive territory,
너무 원론적인 대답만 하고 있어요 지금. 뭐 이거 경제 금융시장의 사이클이랑 그다음에 인플레이션 잡히는 거 뭐 그런 것들, 경제, 금융 뭐 그런 것들 다 사이클 뭐 다른 얘기 그런 것들 등등등 하면서 그냥 원론적인 대답만 하고 별로 영향가는 없는, 우리 주가 시장에는 영향성이 없는 대답이에요.
Let me say this: it is very premature to be thinking about pausing. So people, when they hear lags, they think about a pause. It's very premature, in my view.
위험한 데다.
Pausing our rate hike. We have a ways to go. Our policy.
지금 이자율을 올리는 거 스탑하는 건 아직 좀 프리머추얼하다. 성숙되지 않는 그런 사고다 그런 얘기니까 주가 떡떡
Exactly where that
떨어지는.
is, we have a sense, and we'll write down in the December meeting a new a new summary of economic projections which updates that. But I would expect us to continue to update it based on what we're seeing with incoming data.
아, 이 질문 구리다.
Thanks, Chair Powell. Neil Irwin with Axios. As you look around the economy, the clearest impact of your tightening so far has been on housing, maybe some venture-funded tech companies. It's been relatively narrow in terms of the labor market, consumer demand. A lot of sectors don't see a ton of effect. Is the pathway and channels through which monetary policy works changing? Is it narrower than it used to be? And on housing in particular, are you at all worried that you're crimping housing supply in ways that might cause problems down the road?
I don't know that the channels through which policy works have changed that much. I would say a big channel is the labor market, and the labor market is very, very strong, very strong. And households, by of course, have strong balance sheets. And so we go into this with a strong
완전히 오늘
labor market
탔네요.
and excess demand in the labor market.
질문이
Through
틀렸어.
different things, and also with households who have strong spending power built up. So it may take time. It may take resolve. It may take patience. It's likely to get inflation down. It may. I think you see from our
시작
forecast
좋았는데.
that it will take some time for inflation to come down. It'll take time. We think. So, sorry, was I getting to your question there? Oh, housing, the housing part of it. Yeah. So, you know, we look at housing. Of course, housing is significantly affected by these higher rates, which are really back where they were before the global financial crisis. They're not
이거 모르는 사람이
they're
어딨어.
much higher than they've been. And you're seeing housing activity decline, and you're seeing housing prices growing at a faster rate, and in some parts of the country declining. You know, I would say the housing market was very overheated for the couple of years after the pandemic as demand increased and rates were low.
하우징 마켓은 팬데믹 때부터 아주 뜨거워졌었다 그런 얘기하고 아주 이것도 원론적인 얘기예요. 뭐
No conditions, that kind of thing. So the housing market needs to get back into a balance between.
지난번에 얘기했던 거랑 똑같아요. 하우징 마켓이 이제 좀 쿨다운 돼야 된다.
What's going on there? You know, from a financial stability standpoint, we didn't see in this cycle the kinds of poor credit underwriting that we saw before the global financial crisis. Housing credit was very carefully, much more carefully managed by the lenders. So it's a very different situation, and doesn't present doesn't appear to present financial stability issues. But
지금 하우징 마켓 때문에 생기는 금융시장의 붕괴나 뭐 그런 걸 얘기했는데 거기에는 뭐 아직까지는 큰 문제는 없다 그렇게 얘기해요. 랜딩하고 그런 거 아주 타이트하게 잘 신경 쓰고 있기 때문에.
I wanted to ask about the labor market. You mentioned early on again that job openings are very high compared to available workers, and I'm just curious to what extent you do and don't draw a signal from that. So, for example, if wage growth is slowing and if maybe the unemployment rate starts to tick up, will that make you sort of decrease your focus on job openings? What do you see? Are wages what's really important? How are you thinking about the labor market as it relates to inflation?
so we talk a lot about vacancies and the vacancy to unemployed rate, but it's just one. It's just another data series. It's been you know, unusually important in this cycle because it's been so out of line. But so has quits, so have wages. So we look at, you know, a very wide range of data on the labor market. So you know, I'd start with unemployment, which is typically the single statistic you would look to, is at a 50-year low, 3.5%. We're getting really nothing in labor supply now. We had, I think, a very small increase this year, which we had really thought we would get that back. Most analysts thought we would get some labor supply coming in. You mentioned wages, so I guess I would characterize that as sort of a mixed picture. It's true with average hourly earnings you see, so I would call it a flattening out at a level that's well above the level that would be consistent over time with 2% inflation, you know, assuming a reasonable productivity. There with the ECI reading this week, again, a mixed picture. The headline number was a disappointment. Let's just say it was high. It didn't show a decline. There's some rays of light inside, you know, that if you look at private sector workers, that did come down. The compensation did come down. But overall, though, the broader picture is of an overheated labor market where demand substantially exceeds supply. Job creation still exceeds, you know, the sort of the level that would.
지금 고용 시장은 아직도 여유가 있다 그런 얘기를 계속 하고 있습니다. 그러니까 우리 다 아는 얘기 또 하고 있어요. 이 기자들 참 오늘 준비 안 했다. 질문이 좀
is happening, and maybe next year.
일부러 미리 질문 주고 시작했는지 질문을 좀 별로 시장에 좋게 반영할 질문을 안 하네요.
We want to see, we would love to see vacancies coming down, quits coming down. They are coming down. Vacancies are below their all-time high, but not by as much as we thought, because the data series is volatile. We never take any one reading. We always look at 2 or 3. So it's a mixed picture. I don't see the case for real softening just yet, but we look at, I guess as I just showed you, we look at a very broad range of data on the labor market.
So do you see wages as being a significant driver of inflation?
I think wages have an effect on inflation, and inflation has an effect on wages. I think that's always been the case. There's always a
지금 임금이 인플레이션 올리는 요소냐 그렇게 물어봤어요.
elevated right now. I don't think so. I don't think wages are the principal story of why prices are going up. I don't think that. I also don't think that we see a wage price spiral. But again, it's not something you can, once you see it, you're in trouble. So we don't want to see it. We want wages to go up. We just want them to go up at a level that's sustainable and consistent with 2% inflation.
파웰이 대답한 거는 웨이지 자체가 근본적인 이유는 안 되지만 그게 이유가 되는 걸 보고 싶지는 않다. 이런 얘기를 하면서 좀 웨이지가 올라가야지 또 서스테이너블하게 살 수 있으니까 그런 얘기는 또 원론적인 건 얘기예요. 아주 답은 아니에요.
It can soften through job openings declining. We think there's room for that, but we won't know that. That'll be discovered empirically.
Thank you so much. Kayla Tausche from CNBC. Earlier last month, the United Nations warned that there could be a global recession if central banks didn't change course. The new UK Prime Minister warned of a profound economic crisis there.
이 질문 좋다.
How the Fed is weighing international developments in light of
지금 이 페드의 정책 때문에 국제적으로 다 문제가 되고 있는 거에 대한 질문을 하고 있어요.
So, of course, we keep close tabs on economic developments and also geopolitical developments that are relevant to the economy abroad. We're in very frequent contact with our foreign counterparts, both through the IMF meetings and the regular meetings with central banks that we have, and I have one this weekend with many central bankers. So we're in touch with all of that. So I guess it's clearly a difficult time in the global economy. We're seeing very high inflation in Europe, significantly because of high energy prices related to the war in Ukraine. And, we're seeing China's having issues with the zero COVID policy and, much slower growth than we're used to seeing. So we see those difficulties. The strong dollar is a challenge for some countries, but, we have it, and we take all of that into account in our models. We think about the spillovers and that sort of thing. Here in the United States, we have a strong economy. And we have an economy where inflation is running at 5%. Core PCE inflation, which is a really good indicator of what's going on for us, is the way we see it, is running at 5.1% on a 12-month basis and sort of similar to that on a 3, 6, and 9-month basis. So we know that we need to use our tools to get inflation under control. The world's not going to be better off if we fail to do that. That's a task we need to do.
오케이, 표현은 이거예요. 미국은 잘하고 있고 미국이 제대로 해야지 다른 나라들도 제대로 될 것이다. 이제 그런 식으로 표현을 합니다.
The kind of thing that pays dividends for our economy for decades, hopefully. Even though it may be difficult to get it back, getting it back is something that provides value to the people we serve for the long run.
Thank you. The Fed has acknowledged in the past that the tools that you have don't affect things like energy and food prices that stem from some of those conflicts overseas, and they're some of the biggest pain points for consumers. So as you pursue the current path that you've outlined, is there a risk that some of those prices simply don't come down?
So we don't directly affect, for the most part, food and energy prices, but the demand channel does affect them just at the margin. the thing about the United States is that we also
질문은 페드에서 사용한 툴에는 에너지와 이제 푸드에 대한 어떤 인플레이션은 그게 적용이 안 되는데 지금 임팩트가 있지 않느냐 그런 걸 질문했어요.
which you see in many parts of the economy. So our tools are well suited to work on that problem, and that's what we're doing. You're right though. We don't, you know, the price of oil is set globally, and it's not something we can affect. I think by the actions that we take, though, we help keep you know, longer-term inflation expectations anchored, and keep the public believing in 2% inflation by the things that we do, even in times when energy is part of the story of why inflation is high.
Hi, Chair Powell, Janelle Marte with Bloomberg. So the Fed is facing two more ethics-related incidents with the revision of the financial statements from President Bostic and President Bullard speaking at a closed event. So some senators, like Elizabeth Warren, are saying that this is a sign of greater ethics problems at the Fed. Could you talk about what this does to the public's trust in the bank and what the Fed is doing to prevent this kind of behavior from becoming
저번 때 라파엘 보스틱이 그 트랜잭션 했죠. 블랙아웃 기간 동안 거기에 대해 가지고 질문했어요. 도덕성에 대해서.
Policymakers violates or falls short of those rules, we do risk undermining that trust, and we take that very seriously. We do. So at the beginning of our meeting yesterday, actually, we had a committee discussion of the full committee on the importance of holding ourselves individually and collectively accountable for knowing and following the high standard that's set out in our existing rules with respect to both personal investment activities and external communications. And we've taken a number of steps, and I would just say we do understand how important those issues are. I would say that our new investment program that we have is up now and running, and actually it was through that the problems with President Bostic's disclosures were discovered when he filed his new disclosures. That's, you know, we now have a central group here at the Board of Governors that looks into disclosures and follows them and approves people's disclosures, and also all of their trades. Any trade anyone has to make was covered has to be pre-approved. And there's a lag. It has to be pre-approved 45 days before it happens, so there's no ability to game market. So it's a really good system. It worked here. And I think we all said to each other yesterday morning, we recommitted to each other and to this institution to hold ourselves to the highest standards and avoid these.
자기네들이 정한 룰대로 잘 하기로 다시 리어슈어런스를 했답니다.
So, you know, as you know, I referred the matter concerning President Bostic to the Inspector General, and once that happens, I don't discuss it with the Inspector General or with anybody. It's just the Inspector General has the ability to do investigations. We don't really have that. So that's what
일단 뭐 조사를 하면 자기는 뭐 신경 쓰지 않겠다. 뭐 그런 식으로 대답을 하네요.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Television and Radio. Earlier this year, you touted the 3-month bill yield out to 18 months as the yield curve with 100% explanatory power. And you said, quote, if it's inverted, that means the Fed's going to cut, which means the economy is weak. That curve is only 2 basis points away from inversion now. So I'm wondering why you are so confident that you have not over-tightened, particularly given that rates work with a lag.
Well, so we do monitor the near-term forward spread.
요 질문은 좀 삐딱한데. 저희가 뭐 이제 장단기 금리 차에 대한 얘기 했을 때 그렇게 되게나 안 나도 그렇게까지는 생각하지 않는다 그랬는데 뭐 그거를 지금 보면은 거의 장단기 금리 차가 뒤집어졌는데 거기에 대해서 어떻게 생각하냐 그런 질문을 하네요.
It expects cuts or because it expects inflation to come down. In this case, if you're in a situation where the markets are pricing in significant declines in inflation, that's going to affect the forward curve. So yes, we monitor it. You're right, and that's what I would say.
If I could follow up, you also said several meetings ago that the risk of doing too little outweighed the risk of doing too much. Is what you're trying to tell us today is that risk assessment has changed a little bit?
아, 이것도 질문이
What's
좀
happened is time
삐딱하다.
has passed and we've raised interest rates by 375 basis points. I would not change a word in that statement, though. I think until we get inflation down, you'll be hearing that from me. Again, if we over tighten and we don't want to,
지금 이 얘기는 그냥 뭐 질문도 아니고 대답도 아니고 그냥 스테이트먼트 같아요. 그냥 뭐
then we have the
너무 많이 올려도 문제가 되고 너무 적게 올려도 문제가 된다 그랬는데 거기에 대해서 지금 자기네들 지금 연준이 생각하는 스탠스가 바뀌었느냐 그런 질문인데
activity strongly if that
뭐
happens, if that's
파웰은 그냥
necessary.
바뀐 게 없다
On the other hand,
그런
if
얘기를
you,
해요.
if you make a mistake in the other direction and you let this drag on, then it's a year or two down the road and you're realizing inflation behaving the way it can, you're realizing that you didn't actually get it, you have to go back in. By then, the risk really is that it has become entrenched in people's thinking, and you know the record is that the employment costs, the cost to the people that we don't want to hurt, they go up with the passage of time. That's really how I look at it. So that isn't going to change. What has changed, though, you're right, is we're farther along now, and I think as we're farther along, we're now focused on that. What's the level we need to get to rates, and I don't know what we'll do when we get there. By the way, it doesn't. We'll have to see. There's been no decision or discussion around exactly what steps we would take at that point, but the first thing is to find your way there.
뭐 자기네들이 하는 정책을 마지막에 얘기한 거는 언제 그게 다 완성이 될지는 모른다. 그렇지만 자기는 그 가는 길에 지금 제대로 가고 있다. 그렇게 얘기하네요.
5% the past year and so forth, but none of this is really showing up in, as you know, in the government's inflation measures. And as we go forward, private real-time data is clearly showing these hits to housing. Are you going to need to put a greater weight on that in order to ascertain things like whether there's over-tightening going on? Or will you still focus as much on the more lagging government indicators?
So this is an interesting subject. So I start by saying, I guess, that the measure that's in the CPI and the PCE, it captures rents for all tenants, not just new leases. And that makes sense, actually, because for that reason, that conceptually, that's sort of the right target for monetary policy. And the same thing is true for owner's equivalent rent, which comes off of it's a reweighting of tenant rents. The private measures are of course good at picking up the at the margin the new leases, and they tell you a couple things. One thing is I think right now if you look at the
오케이, 너무 지루하니까 여기까지만 할게요. 지금 질문 나오는 거 보면은 진짜로 시장에서 이렇게 우와 할 만한 그런 질문이 별로 없었어요. 아까 CNBC 기자 질문만 조금 시장에서 이해할 수 있는 그런 질문을 했죠. 나머지 질문들은 다 너 이런 얘기 했었는데 지금 어떻게 생각하니? 이렇게 좀 rhetorical question 아니면은 약간 sarcastic하게 질문을 해. 제가 볼 땐 그래요. 그냥 심플하게 지금 퍼징 하냐 안 하냐, 앞으로 더 올릴 거냐 아니냐 그런 질문을 해주면 딱딱 답이 나올 텐데 지금 시장이 원하는 앤서를 하지 않아요. 어쨌거나 지금 지금까지 기자회견한 거에 대해 가지고 그냥 제 느낌은 바뀐 건 하나도 없습니다. 바뀐 건 하나도 없고 그냥 그 시장이 그냥 기술적으로 한번 반등을 할 거에 대한 거를 이유를 찾았던 게 이제 이자율을 올리는 거를 좀 속도 조절을 하는 논의를 다음 달에 해보겠다 그 얘기예요. 딱 그거 하나. 그 다음에 그 후에 더 올릴지 안 올릴지에 대한 어떤 클리어한 앤서는 주지도 않았어요. 그리고 항상 아직 되지 않았다. 그리고 아까도 얘기했지만 우리가 언제 끝낼지 어디서 끝낼지는 모르겠는데 지금 그 방향으로 가고 있다. 이제 그 얘기까지 하고 그러니까 진짜로 답 안 주는 질문 질의응답이에요.
Estimated in September, the incoming data suggests that that's actually going to be higher, and that's been the pattern. I mean, I would have little confidence that the forecast
여러분들 혹시 듣고 계신 분들 있으면은 또 첨삭하실 거 있으면 좀 말씀해 주시고요. 지금 이제 딱 주가를 보면은 그대로 제자리로 돌아왔어요. 그대로 제자리로 돌아왔고 여기서 이제 좀 끼뚱끼뚱하고 있는 그런 모양이에요. 이 기자회견은 완전히 끝나 봐야지 시장이 완전히 방향을 잡고 움직일 것 같은데 지금은 기자회견 나오는 얘기 때문에 뭐가 폭탄이 터질까 봐 이렇게 조금 주저하고 있는 그런 느낌이에요. 그래서 저도 지금 이거를 안 들을 수도 없고 듣기 싫은데.
Is that I would want people to understand our commitment to getting this done, and to not making the mistake of not doing enough, or the mistake of withdrawing our strong policy and doing that too soon. So those I control those messages, and that's my job.
Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. Thank you, Fed Chairman. So how big of a headwind is all the fiscal spending to what the Federal Reserve is trying to do to get inflation back to the 2% target?
You know, in theory, it was a headwind this year, but I do think the broader context is that you have households that have these significant amounts of savings and can keep spending, even in. So I think those two things do tend to wage to sort of counter.
지금 뭐 미국 가정에 다 아직도 돈이 있고 계속 돈을 지출을 한다 뭐 그런 얘기를 하는데 지출 안 하는데.
The banks that deal with retail customers and many retailers will tell you that the consumers are still buying and they're still they're fine. So I don't know how big the fiscal headwinds are, and they haven't shown up in the way that we thought they would in restraining spending. So it must have to do with the savings that people have.
Spending, there's tens of billions yet to be spent. I mean, from the Inflation Reduction Act, the American Rescue Plan, CHIPS Act, bipartisan infrastructure bill. How does that go and play into your thinking about the future?
You know, it's demand is going to have some support from those savings, and also from the strong demand that's still in the labor market. We still see pretty significant demand and a tightening.
그러니까 말이에요. 지금 미국 가정에 돈이 없는데 무슨 소리야 연준은. 지네들이 돈 다 뺏어가 놓고서.
And what those things tell us is that our job is going to require some resolve and some patience over time. We're going to have to stick with this. That's just we take all that as a given, but we know what our objective is. We know what our tools can do, and that's how we think about it.
Chair Powell, Nancy Marshall-Genzer from Marketplace. I'm wondering, has the window for a soft landing narrowed? Do you still think it's
이 얘기도 벌써 나왔던 얘기 아니야. 그 소프트 랜딩이 점점 좁아지고 있다. 그거 오늘 아리클에 나온 얘기인데 그 얘기를 뭐 질문 또 다시 하고 그래.
To see the path it's narrowed. I would say the path is narrowed over the course of the last year, really. Hard to say.
지금 또 주가 떨어지잖아. 소프트 랜딩이 점점 내로우해진다 그러니까. 이게 기자들 오늘 진짜 완벽하게 작전하고선 쇼 딱 포지션 해놓고서 한 것 같아.
There is a path to. Ordinarily, there's a relationship to GDP going down and vacancies declining, translating into unemployment. Or there's Okun's law. So all those things are relationships that are in the data, and they're very real. It is a little bit different this time, though, because you have this tremendously high level of vacancies, and we think on a very steep part of the beverage curve. All I would say is that the job losses may turn out to be less than would be indicated by those traditional measures because job openings are so elevated and because the labor market is so. Again, that's going to be something we discover.
지금 딴 나라에 살고 있는 사람들 같아. 지금 뭐 자기 일자리를 잃어도 우리가 지금 저기 통계적으로 나오는 것보다는 덜 잃었을 것이다. 뭐 이런 식으로 얘기를 해요. 왜냐면 잡 오프닝이 훨씬 많으니까. 이 아저씨 탁상공론 같아.
All over time, and that's what we're going to do.
just real quickly, why do you feel like the window is narrowed?
Because we haven't seen inflation coming down. If
오케이, 소프트 랜딩이 왜 어려워 보이냐 그랬더니 지금 인플레이션이 안 내려와서 그렇다.
What I would expect by now to have seen is that
이거는 진짜 자폭하는 거 아니에요?
supply side problems had resolved themselves. We would have expected goods inflation to come down by now, long since by now. And it really hasn't, although it has come down, but it's not to the extent we had hoped. At the same time, now you see services inflation, core services inflation moving up. And I just think that the inflation picture has become more and more challenging over the course of this year, without question. That means that we have to have policy deal.
어쨌거나 시간이 점점 없네요. 좀 파열에 빨리 들어가야지 시장이 반등을 하든 떨어지든 할 텐데. 마무리 하셨네요. 들어가세요. 오케이, 여러분. 지금 수고하셨습니다. 지루한 시간. 근데 이게 지루하지만 또 우리가 이게 안 볼 수도 없는 거고요. 또 뭔 얘기를 했는지 또 모르면 또 반응하기도 어렵고 그러니까. 그래서 결론적으로 여러분들도 들으셨겠지만 그냥 제가 그냥 느낌으로 평가하는 거는 영향가 없다. 시장에 그렇게 호재로 작용할 내용이 하나도 없다. 실망스럽다. 그렇게 결론이 될 것 같아요. 지금 앞으로 5분 안에 주식 반등 못하면 땅으로 꽂힐 것 같아요. 그게 저의 감입니다. 그 인플레이션을 잡기 힘들 것 같아요. 근데 인플레이션은 이제 인플레이션으로 잡아야죠. 커머더티는 커머더티로 잡듯이 이제 비싸져서 안 써서 결국 그거의 원리는 비싸가지고 안 써가지고 수요가 적어져서 잡겠다는 그런 건데 시간이 오래 걸릴 것 같아요. 어렵네요. 뭐 중요한 거는 다 끝났으니까 여기까지 보시면 될 것 같고요. 지금 뭐 더 이상 뭐 볼 게 없어요. 근데 오늘 하루의 리액션 가지고 또 내일이 어떻게 될지 여러분들이 그거를 너무 속단하기는 좀 이른 상황이고요. 오늘 이런 얘기도 했어요. 오늘 연준 발표가 있는데도 몇몇 그 애널리스트들이 나와가지고 테크니컬 애널리스트죠. 나와가지고 보통 그게 되게 위험한 얘기거든요. 오늘 연준 발표하는데 나와가지고 주가가 올라가고 내려가고 얘기를 하는 거는. 그래서 지금 스토리는 뭐 지금 마이클 윌슨이 얘기했듯이 어쨌건 이번 페드 발표와 상관없이 200일 평균선까지는 한번 터치를 하고 다시 내려갈 가능성이 있다. 지금 그래서 아래로는 전 저점인 3,450 뭐 그 정도까지 열어놓고 위로는 200일 평균선까지 한번 터치를 하고 발음을 확인하고 1월부터 올라가겠다. 뭐 이런 스토리를 나는 사람들이 있어요. 그러니까 지금 오늘 같은 경우에 지금 시장의 반응이 좀 미직지근합니다. 미직지근한데 이 미직지근한 게 그래도 여기서 멎어질지 아니면은 더 떨어질지 향후 한 5분은 지켜보세요. 그러면 될 것 같습니다. 일단 방송은 여기서 마치도록 하겠습니다. 수고하셨습니다.